Welcome to the Counselling Armchair, hosted by the counselling team at RMIT University. This podcast aims to help you manage your university life so you can be at your best. We'll be sharing with you tips on student life here and ways to enhance your mental well-being.
Welcome back, everybody. We have a very special guest with us today who we're excited to talk to. So please welcome Piera Ibrahim, who is the Senior Advisor for International Student Wellbeing here at RMIT. How are you, Piera?
I'm doing very well.
Oh, good. It's great to have you here with us. So I think let's just start with getting you to tell us a bit about yourself and your role here at RMIT.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So as you've mentioned, I am the Senior Advisor for International Student Wellbeing at RMIT University, and I have worked in RMIT in student services for over 16 years, undertaking different roles to support RMIT students. So in this current role, which I commenced last year as a result of RMIT's response to wanting to support international students offshore, particularly those that could not travel to Australia because of the consequences of COVID. Having what we call the IERF funding meant RMIT could implement a range of initiatives, my role being one of them, to help international students with a range of career and wellbeing supports.
That sounds like a great initiative from RMIT, because it's been a tough 3 years, hasn't it? Particularly for international students.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like a much needed response.
And I think you're the perfect person for it, Piera, because we've known each other for a long time and you've worked at RMIT in other capacities before, but you've also a careers counsellor and you've also worked in student counselling at other universities, and you've been a teacher as well, and now you're a social worker. So I think you've got the trifecta of skills to be best placed to do this role.
Thank you. Yes, my passion is about helping students in all capacities. So this is definitely another role in supporting students so that they can be able to study and undertake their studies and be also connected to services, especially that we've got so many services at RMIT.
So true.
Yeah. Well, I guess getting us started, maybe looking at with the lockdowns ending, there's a gradual return to studying on campus and within the face-to-face settings. Piera, what do you think would be some of the impacts the last 3 years of remote and online learning will have on our students returning to the face-to-face learning this time around?
Well, it is definitely a huge transition for students to be actually attending to RMIT, especially if this is their first time. And so what it's going to be a little bit tricky is that we know that pre-COVID that students, when they are transitioning from their home country to a new country, we say they're like foreigners in a place that they haven't been, and there's different ways of doing things, different cultures, the language differences. Right. But in particular with COVID, I'd say that there's extra challenges because we've got also students who started their RMIT program and perhaps will be transitioning in their third year. So they're not really starting from first year. So that adds even more pressure, to them. So sometimes I find that this sort of phase of transition can be really, really tricky and quite difficult, especially because it might be the first time that they are moving from their home with their sort of networks and supports, and then all of a sudden they're coming into a new environment and perhaps a new lifestyle. And so it's about then looking at, well, how are they going to then maybe coping skills that they've never had to consider before. So that could be another thing that as they start their new study adventures, it's also looking at, well, how do they adjust? And sometimes I speak to students about the whole adjustment cycle, and this adjustment cycle is looking at sometimes students can, what we say, romanticize about what it's going to be like and the adventure, and they think of all the really wonderful things they're about to embark. And we say that when they commence the adventure of being in a new country, we sometimes say that they go through what we call the honeymoon stage, so where everything is great and they're feeling really excited and everything's quite new. And then what happens is that then they get past the honeymoon stage and the reality starts to sink in. And it's that whole, all of a sudden, there's the responsibilities that come with being independent and looking after yourself. There's nobody telling you that, or cooking perhaps your meals for you, or some of the things that would be quite different. And so when that settles, that sets in the reality is that we can sometimes go into that slump of the pressures that come with the transition. And that's where, from that, we say that students can then go into that trying to find, I guess, perhaps that resilience to get through that stage, and then they start to learn some coping mechanisms on how to overcome with those challenges. So we see it that it's not linear. You get some peaks and some troughs and then peaks up again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine for third-year students who are transitioning into campus life or in-person study, there used to be maybe their habits, learning habits, study habits, or just standard life routine if they were learning remote, and their sense of self perhaps might be quite intact. But then coming to, as you say, they're actually not a first-year student anymore. But there are some parts of themselves having to learn about or adjust to living here or adjusting to uni like a first-year student. And there is a bit of disparity because some of those resources that we might have available in supporting students adjusting are often for more first-year students or younger students. And then they might feel a little bit displaced in terms of, do I want to join this or that if I'm already third year or I've only got a semester to go?
Like, is it worth it kind of thing?
That's right. That's right. But in fact, it might be helpful because it helps them feel a little bit more settled into uni life or campus life.
Yeah, and I think that's really important that you raise that, because especially when sometimes you could just either stay with your studies and go home and either stick sometimes with other students from similar cultural background. But that's where, by doing that and living sort of that insular lifestyle, that we've got to be thinking about, well, what are the things that you can do to step out of your comfort zone and get to know your surroundings, like be a bit of a tourist and start to connect with not only just sort of what you know, but what about the other sorts of, I guess, events and activities that are going out. It can be scary and daunting, but it also can be a really great opportunity to get to know your surroundings and actually start to participate in perhaps really fun and exciting events and activities and even clubs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that it is such a challenge adjusting to a new place, and there's a lot of things that you just don't even anticipate that might be an issue. Like, I think one might be food. You know, I always remember years ago I went on a trip to South America and to the Falkland Islands. Long story, but anyway, we were gone for about a month and I was like, oh my God, I miss Vegemite. People who are listening from not from Australia won't get this at all, because if anyone's tried Vegemite, they go, it's disgusting. But we Australians, we love our Vegemite, don't we? And it's very much a breakfast staple. And it's so funny that that's like, it's such a little thing that I would not have even thought about, but that I really missed. And that added to my sense of homesickness. So sometimes it can be the little things that catch you out that you're just not anticipating. And I really related to what you said about all that stuff about independent living for the first time, because you've been at home, you've been learning remotely, you've had, maybe if you're living with your folks, you've got someone cooking meals for you and looking out for you and taking care of you, and all of a sudden you have to do all that yourself. And so it can be really tempting to just withdraw in on yourself and just have a very small life here in Australia. But what I was thinking about while you were talking before is that it seems to be like what you're saying is balance is really important. So certainly finding some of the comforts of home, finding people who speak your language, finding places you can eat your food and experience, you know, have your cultural experiences, but also branch out and go and pat a kangaroo and, you know, I'm bringing out all the Aussie cliches now. But, you know, like have a Melbourne experience, get out there a little bit, but it may be a balance between those two things.
And I think that's an important point that you raise in terms of the balance, because what I want to also bring up is about what we sometimes refer to homesickness and social isolation. Now, they're very common experiences faced by international students and sometimes students who might be coming from the country or a rural background and then coming into a sort of a very fast-paced Melburnian life, for example. Now, When I say homesickness, I refer to homesickness can be explained as a feeling of longing or just for one's hometown or country, which can be triggered by various factors such as cultural differences, unfamiliar surroundings, and distance from friends and family. Social isolation, on the other hand, refers to a lack of social interaction and feeling disconnected from one's community, which can be due to language barriers, cultural differences, or not having a support system in place. We always say that both homesickness and social isolation can really have a negative impact on the mental health and overall well-being of international students, or students again that feel they're experiencing that isolation. And it's important for them to seek support and find ways to connect with others. You've mentioned just really great ways of just getting out there and patting a kangaroo, like you said, or doing some, it is really important that also international students are monitoring, and other students in general, how they manage their stress effectively, especially when they're starting to feel those feelings, like identifying it and not just trying to convince yourself that you need to snap out of it, or that, for example, students in their third year that have come down thinking, well, I'm not a first year and I should have this all together and I have been studying online. Sometimes when we put that pressure on ourselves and we have those must and I should, that can just really contribute to putting that, not only that unnecessary pressure, but also that stress that's really going to impact our overall well-being and how we just function in life.
And it might mean that you don't then stop to take care of yourself, because, as you said, should, must be doing better than you are, rather than acknowledging that change is difficult for everyone, even people who like change. I'm someone who doesn't like change. I'll freely admit that. And what I've learned about myself is when I'm going through big changes, and every time I've gone through a big change in my life, I really have some growing pains. And sometimes I'll be in the middle of it and go, why do I feel so terrible? And I'm like, yes, this is a change. And that's why change is hard for me. So I think even just acknowledging, even if change hasn't been hard for you before, that for most humans, change is a challenge.
Yes.
Even a positive change is a challenge. And so there might be some feelings associated with that, some negative feelings or some difficult feelings. And I think if you don't stop to acknowledge that and have that self-compassion, right, to give yourself a break and say, of course, it's understandable that I'm feeling this way. This is a big adjustment that I'm going through.
Yeah.
It's inevitable.
And I think that when we're having those feelings, not to deny those feelings, and there are also services. So I'm going to also mention that RMIT counselling services. It's really important because it's free, confidential and professional short-term counselling for any students experiencing mental health issues like anxiety, depression, perhaps those transitional issues that are coming about, just those cultural changes, or absolutely anything. So I don't think there hasn't been anything that you haven't heard before.
Indeed, no. We've heard it all. We've heard it all. Yeah. And I think we're a pretty nice bunch over here at RMIT Counselling Service, aren't we, Yvonne? We are welcoming. Pat ourselves on the back, We're not scary. We're not scary.
Well, you get to hear about us before you meet with us too in this forum.
Yeah.
I think also with change, we probably expect some uncertainties with change. When we're choosing to move somewhere, we've decided to live abroad for an X amount of time. So there's an anticipated change, and there seems to be built in this level of expectation of certain uncertainties. But then we also know that when we land in a different country, that there's also the unanticipated changes that come up, or unexpected things that do come up, and we do have to actually roll with it. We have to go with the flow. We have to adapt to that. We have to try to be flexible, and those things can sometimes be quite difficult for some people that don't anticipate it or hope things are going to go really smoothly, but that may not be the case. And I think that's important to really reflect on, or just to prepare for as well. To prepare for the unexpected, to prepare also for, there may be some bumps along the way. As you talk about that cultural adjustment curve earlier, that's what brought to mind, is we do have an idealized version of what life was going to be like living abroad or studying abroad. And then sometimes as we live there a little bit longer, the feelings start to wear off and the novelty wears off a little bit. So it kind of affects our self-esteem or confidence a bit. when that happens. And so we end up feeling like, oh, hang on a minute, this is not always what I pictured it to be in the first place.
Yeah.
And having to adapt to that takes a bit of time. So being kind to ourselves too.
Absolutely. And also to know that perhaps you're thinking that it's just you going through those feelings and emotions, and you'd be surprised of how many students go through, even students that have actually been living in Australia all their life, that whole even adjustment from high school into, going into university, or even mature age students who perhaps haven't been at uni for many, many years, and then they're, again, adjusting into. So I guess everybody's on a different journey, different experiences and the pressures, but to know that you're not alone, and that there are many people who are also feeling, the butterflies in the stomach as they start to even get ready for orientation day, and having all those questions of, am I going to get lost, and, who am I going to meet? I was going to say there is the Piera at RMIT, and that's a great, RMIT, its commitment to helping every student feeling mentally healthy. And so this is a really wonderful mental wellbeing initiative that there's a great team that they help with the preventative, just in terms of helping with your mental wellbeing. It runs programs for students to help them look after their mental health, and just to help students know, where to go, where to access that information. So that might be a really another useful tool that while you're embarking or going through those transitional experiences, if there are other things that can aid in your mental wellbeing, like I said, I'm going to strongly encourage these free services that are available to all RMIT students.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that sort of segues nicely into thinking about that idea about homesickness that you mentioned before, and social connection, because I think that's such a key factor, isn't it, in the adjustment process. There's the homesickness, like you mentioned, the longing and the sadness and grief and that aspect of it, and the challenges in adjusting. But, you mentioned before, Piera, that sometimes people can become really insular and sort of isolate themselves. So what have you noticed in terms of working with international students about that? Like, what are some themes about that, and what are some ideas maybe about what people can do about that to maybe not get caught into that trap maybe of becoming really isolated?
Yeah, so sometimes the tendency is to just stick with perhaps other students that come from the same sort of, cultural background or from the same hometown, and feel like you start to develop a sort of almost like a dependency on them, and feeling as though that's the only way you're going to be able to survive, because you don't have, I guess, that network of supports, especially when coming into a new country. But what I want to sort of emphasize is that there are so many opportunities for international students to make new connections on campus at RMIT and also outside of RMIT. So, they can visit what we call Study Melbourne. They've got wonderful resources, and one of it's called Making Friends. And there's, again, ample opportunities that international students can participate in reading up about how to go about making friends, and events that they have outside of RMIT. Again, at RMIT, there are so many club sports, and they have these events, what we call campus life at RMIT. So, you'll find every student are able to find several clubs and societies that are on campus, so that students can easily find people with perhaps the same interest. And so, there are clubs that cover everything from spirituality, culture, professions, sports, fun, and a whole bunch of other interests. So I'm probably imagining that there will be something that it would be an interest that somebody can find other people who are what we call like-minded. And that could be a really great way to have some similarities, and that can start the beginning of that connection. And also there is the RMIT Curup community. So again, we always recommend for any students who want to make friends. Now, the Curup community helps international students connect with other students. They also explore Melbourne, and they talk about things that matter to them. So that's a really great way of breaking the ice and finding an opportunity to connect with other people. And especially for people who are an introvert, and just that whole feeling of, I've got to put myself out there. What I'd say is that it can be quite scary and daunting, even for extroverts who perhaps, had a whole group of friends and family members in their home home country and they feel like they're starting all over again. And again, it can be those feelings, scary, putting yourself out there, wanting to make a good impression. But again, we can sometimes be our own worst enemy and start to talk ourselves out of it and think, oh, it's just too much pressure, it's too hard, and then, isolate ourselves. And what I'd like to encourage everyone to do is to say, okay, you don't have to make hundreds of friends, even if it's one or two, just getting a start, finding maybe the other person who's also perhaps maybe shy and finding ways to starting a conversation. And that's why orientation is fantastic, because everybody sort of can be in that same boat. And for people who are starting in their final year or in their second year that perhaps didn't start face-to-face because of COVID, again, there's a group of people that are also starting that whole experience of trying to connect and trying to navigate, well, how does that whole connecting face-to-face, because especially we've been doing it for the past 3 years online, and so we sort of developed those habits where we've learned to sort of connect online, or sometimes we don't feel comfortable even putting our cameras on, and then all of a sudden there's that pressure that we need to be present, we need to be connecting with other people, and that can also be additional pressure, especially when we haven't been doing that for over the years.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned all those fantastic opportunities, which I would echo. They're great opportunities to take advantage of. Something that occurred to me while you were speaking as well is I was remembering someone that I worked with a long time ago who was very socially anxious, and we talked about how she was going to it was like a conference type thing. She's like, oh, I don't know, what to do, and it's like, what do you usually do? I usually walk in and sit at the back as far away from everyone as I possibly can, and I have my head down and I don't look at anyone, and then I don't talk to anyone all day. And it's like, okay, what you need to do is this. You need to walk in and you need to walk up to a table of people and say, can I sit here? And then introduce yourself and start a conversation. She's like, oh God, do people do that? And it's like, yes, they do. But, I think for some cultures, maybe that's not a common way of behaving, but here certainly it is, and no one would blink an eye. And that sort of cultural knowledge can be useful in a way of like, what is the norm here, so that you can make those social connections. And so, but if you have those sort of things like Kirrup and Study Melbourne and so on as an opportunity where there's people that are going to help, like facilitate those conversations. So it's not just you walking up to a table full of strangers and saying, hi, my name's Liz, can I sit here, sort of thing, which is really daunting if you're not used to doing that, let alone if you're doing it in a language that's not your first language and in a place that's really unfamiliar for you. I think
maybe even just starting with that, can I sit here, or can I sit with you? And that might be it's an openness, it's a invitation to have more dialogue if they wish to. Yes. But at least it kind of warms you up to the idea that it's okay to sit next to someone, or it's okay if you say hi. It's a way of acknowledging your classmate, whether you're a third year or whether you are a first year student, you're all on the same page or in the same boat, returning to campus. Maybe some are better adjusted to than others. Maybe that looks like that on the surface. We don't know.
True.
So lots of people might mask that too, and it's helpful if you just try to give it a go and sit there and or invite or be a bit more inviting, and that might generate a dialogue.
And I think that's really important to know that sometimes by taking that first step, you've probably helped the other person who also
doesn't that just break the ice.
And there's so much literature online on finding some almost like introduction lines to starting a conversation. Again, I mentioned the Study Melbourne that has Making Friends, but again, just being really creative on a Google search and seeing ways to initiate conversation, or what are the ways. Because I think there's been people out there who went through that, pioneered through making friendships and coming from another country, and then helping and almost having tips on how do you start the whole process of, making friends. And if that is too daunting on the person listening to this podcast about, the thought of initiating a conversation, again, sometimes it's joining those clubs where it takes pressure It's just an interest that everybody who is attending, and that can sometimes the facilitator could have those ice-breaking games and making those connections. So there's different ways as to how one will feel comfortable, whether they want to initiate or they don't want to do that, but perhaps just being present.
That's the start, isn't it?
Yeah,
You're not actually there.
Because you're seen.
Nothing's going to happen.
You're noticed, you're seen, and you're there, and you create opportunities by being there. But if you're not, there's no opportunities.
Yeah.
And you end up isolating yourself further. Piera, you mentioned about orientation. I know that in the past there's been campus tours, so it's great for students who are, let's say, well into their study or finishing their semesters, or even towards the end of their degree. It's still great to do the campus tours. It's a great way to meet people and familiarise yourself with the campus and or different spaces. And maybe that helps feel like you're also belonging to part of the university rather than having this online presence. And you're meeting people outside of your course or program. And that helps to also get that network happening outside of the actual degree.
Absolutely. And I think there is, which is perhaps just been released, there is a lot of those podcasts or like the how-to, even watching the how-to, then they'll have events or activities going on. So again, it's looking at that it's not just sometimes specific to, say, your program that you're studying. There could be a whole range of opportunities just to get you started. Even prior to arriving to Australia, sometimes they're just really great resources and really familiarising yourself with your surroundings. Like I always recommend that students, just before even they leave their home country, that it's looking at where are they going to be living in sort of the location, what is their surroundings, what are the services that might be available to them. All of that is really, really important, and that sometimes can also ease that feeling of nervousness and stress and anxiety, because you're able to start to see your settings, your environment, just making yourself familiar with even the university services that are available, and also perhaps the institution in terms of the staff and the services, because I think it's really important to know what are those resources and services that are available, and especially in case of an emergency. So you have a backup plan.
Well, we do that when we travel, right? We're encouraged to do that to prepare for our travel whenever we go on holidays. Much like that, we probably want to do that if we're going to be planning on living abroad for an extended amount of time. You want to be able to prepare some things and or do some research beforehand, particularly around safety or security, which I know you'll talk about later as well.
Yeah.
Moving on to maybe a different part of the student experience, question for Piera might be, what do you see would be some of the academic challenges that international students might experience here?
Well, first of all, as I touched on briefly, for the fact of, we've had 3 years. And so for people who, or students who have undertaken their studies in a remote capacity, so a lot of that online learning, there's those challenges that students can face, because, again, as students transition to that face-to-face, those challenges can really be then amplified, especially if there might be some issues with like language proficiency, the expectation of the standards of the assessment, and also how people view sharing of, say, assessments. So in some countries, it is the norm that people share their assessments, and it's not considered, there's no negative consequences of doing that, whereas we know that academic integrity is really important, especially at RMIT. And so plagiarism, which is the copying and not referencing work, can have those negative consequences. It's really, really important that, I guess, that students, now that they're becoming involved in new ways of learning and new approaches to assessment tasks. And that is why it's great that RMIT can help all students to succeed in not only their academic but their study goals. So there is something, the Learning Lab, they've created a series of videos, and actually it's targeted to 4 areas that international students often find new and can be, a little difficult at first. So I would definitely recommend to watch those series of videos. But there's also the RMIT University Library, and they offer free study support services and resources, so all students can build their academic skills, study techniques, and all other aspects of that. We've got the after hours study help called Studio C, and that's available 24/7 in terms of assistance. And also there's peer mentoring. So this is students helping students achieve, helping them with assistance with their coursework, sharing general study skills and encouraging just to build up their confidence. There's so many range of supports and services so that all students, not just international students, are just not navigating this alone, and especially because RMIT understands that this is going to be quite a challenge, because especially we first pre-COVID and when COVID first came about, a lot of academics had to sort of then use the content of their curriculum that was actually developed in that mind of face-to-face, and they had to move online. But now we're going the other way around.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that takes adjustments. Students are struggling. It's quite easy to perhaps use other people's work, or even there's been quite a lot of talk with artificial intelligence. Things like that is really, really important, because, again, sometimes we're not aware that if we're not citing the correct methods in how we're producing our work, that can have some real negative ramifications and consequences. So if you're not sure, again, there's all these academic support services that are available to support, and especially if you're struggling, or, there are all these other adjustments, that there are all services to help with all concerns that students might have.
Yeah, I recommend the RMIT study support. I think if you Google that, it comes up with the very comprehensive icons and or tabs of what you have already described as well. So they're a great resource which is put together by the library or managed by the library.
Yep. Yeah.
The other place that might be worthwhile thinking about would be connecting with, and international students I know pay as part of their SAF fees to student unions. So maybe it's helpful for them to be familiar with the RUSU or RMIT Student Union, that you know your rights and responsibilities as a student.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that international students sometimes tell us is a struggle is that they're invited to share their opinion on things so much more. Like, it isn't so much about memorising a whole lot of information and being able to reproduce that in an assessment environment, but where they need to provide their own perspective on it or think critically and analytically, and that might be a bit new. And so I think that can be something that going to the online learning lab, as you guys have mentioned, could be a really good way to sort of go, what's the style of learning in Australia? Because it might be a little bit different to what they've been used to. And maybe, if they've been learning online from their home country at RMIT, they might already have a bit of familiarity with that. I guess a class where everyone has their camera off and no one says anything, which is what sort of happens in online classes compared to an in-person tutorial where the teacher's going to look at you and go, what do you think, Johnny? And you're going to have to say something, might be really daunting. And so utilising those resources, please, they're there, use them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the other things I was thinking about that can be a challenge for international students is working to support themselves. So obviously people have living expenses when they come, and so it's common for international students to find work here, and that's totally appropriate. There used to be a limit on the number of hours worked because there's perhaps an understanding that if you work too much that you might jeopardise your study performance, but that's sort of all been lifted, hasn't it? So I guess it could be tempting to work a lot more hours, maybe even like full-time hours. What impact do you think that could have on an international student, Piera?
Yeah, that was a very common issue that I had to deal with as a student counsellor in a previous role. And especially when there was a pressure for students to finance not only their studies but also living arrangements here in Australia, where they would take on a lot of work because, again, the 40 hours a fortnight was removed, and there was the opportunities to take on, retail hospitality jobs. But what I got to see and students got to experience was they were so exhausted from, undertaking so much work that they just didn't have the energy or the focus and attention to really complete the required readings and their assessments. In fact, they ended up impacting their academic abilities because they had nothing more to give because they were working really, really long hours. So I think it's really important to consider, at the end of the day, your students still have to pay the programs they're undertaking. And I guess looking at the consequences of if, their studies are being impacted and then they start to fail because they just don't have the energy and the attention to complete the work to the level that they are able to complete, it's important to see, well, what are the consequences for taking on work? There is
it can have a domino effect from what you're saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess it's really important that perhaps unpacking this there are free one-on-one career consultation sessions at RMIT. So we've got RMIT Careers and Employability, and there's the job shop on campus. I think that's really important because sometimes when there might be a bit of an internal struggle of, I've got the ability to work as many hours and I'm just going to continue to make as much money as I can because I've got that ability. But then, what are the consequences? And especially if you're looking for work and, and the employer sees that perhaps you failed units because at that time you were taking on more work. How's that going to impact not only your ability to complete your program while you're here, but what are those outcomes for when you graduate? And the employer is asking you questions about or looking at your academic transcript. So perhaps having some advice on, not only career pathways, but also, you might be thinking, all right, well, I'm wanting to find some part-time work. So there is a service that somebody can look at your job application and give you feedback. Also, RMIT has the 24/7 online career resources, so that can help them with planning their career, improving their skills, and again, perfecting their application. And there is also the RMIT Careers Mentoring Program, and that's great because it connects students with an industry professional and they provide them with mentorship, and it can just really help them in shaping their work readiness. So looking at what are those skills that you're going to need as you undertake your program? Are you undertaking the right opportunities so that you can be career ready for, especially when you graduate, or other opportunities?
Absolutely.
So great resources that RMIT has got available to all students.
Yes, absolutely. And I was thinking too, with the work sort of space with students and maybe particularly international students might be a bit vulnerable to this, but is with you're getting jobs that are sort of a bit under the table, cash in hand, that maybe don't have the protections that other sort of more reputable employers may have. And you may not know, which ones to trust and which ones not to trust coming into Australia. But, you can be really badly taken advantage of or underpaid. And so I will say that it's even worth, you can go on to Fair Work Australia, for example, to find out about what you should be paid in different industries like retail, like hospitality and so on, so that you know whether you're getting a fair go there. As it is easy to be exploited. And so checking with someone before accepting a job might be a really good thing to do as well.
Yeah, and I think that's quite important because especially for employers who want to pay what we call under the table, meaning that it's in a way that it's like cash in hand. If something happens to that student, an injury occurs, the employer can relinquish all responsibilities and there's no real paper trail that you've even worked there. So it's really important that there are laws in place to protect the worker. And so if there are things that, say, a student is in doubt in terms of employment conditions and there are concerns, then again, there are services that are available on RMIT, services that they can go off and have a look, whether it is at the, RMIT Careers and Employability, that they can direct you to the right places to know. But there's also the RMIT legal services as well.
Yes, there is.
So I thought that's also important, especially if things aren't quite right, that you need to get some sort of professional advice on.
And even if they don't know, they can direct you to the right resources. But I know with, sometimes understanding Fair Work, it can be a bit of navigating that really bulky lot of information. So legal or jobs and careers might help with try to condense some of that more.
Help you understand it in a more sort of accessible way rather than all that sort of jargon heavy language.
But Fair Work is a good website to know.
Yeah, definitely. You can ring them as well and just have a conversation with them and they can give you some advice. Yeah.
Maybe changing topics again a little bit. I'm wondering, Piera, what are some of the potential challenges international students might experience in terms of accommodation?
Yeah, so especially now, I think that might be in the media that trying to attain a rental property might be very challenging, especially with the influx of, say, international students coming to Australia. Now, again, in terms of, I guess, the cost of these rental properties, and sometimes, international students might experience, or students perhaps in general, might experience perhaps some dodgy accommodation. I think it's really important to, that students sometimes can actually organise their accommodation ahead of time with the help of RMIT. And so there is a range of housing options that students can feel comfortable and secure. Now, we've got at RMIT what we call, student welfare advisors, and they can help students with information on housing options that suit a student's need, advice on rental and tenancy issues. I think that's really important. There's also information about moving in and moving out of a property, and even advice on financial support and budgeting, because again, sometimes, if you've been in your country and you're living at home, you might not actually experience all these expenses that come about with becoming independent and having to budget, I guess, those living costs from, your rent to groceries and all of that. Again, it's very simple to start the process by contacting student welfare advisors at RMIT. But I also think that it's really important because sometimes we all actually can be quite naive, and sometimes it can look like a great opportunity, to get, say, a cheap accommodation, and then it's actually... It can be, I have heard of scams that have occurred. So, people paying for, accommodation before they've arrived, only to know that it wasn't a real accommodation. They've received money. So I also have to really point out to be wary of that there are scams and, people preying on people that might be quite innocent or vulnerable or looking for accommodation, especially now with the recent changes of, international students coming to Australia, and they might have not anticipated, I guess, that quick, they might have thought, I'm going to, move to Australia, say, middle of the year in semester 2, and now there have been some changes where they might be having to come quite quickly, and sometimes in that sort of haste and having to quickly secure accommodation can come with not really properly investigating those accommodations options. So I think that might be really helpful to get in contact with the student welfare advisors to be supported in that sort of process for looking for accommodation.
Definitely.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah. And the other thing that we were just thinking about is the on-campus experience, and that can be daunting as well, like particularly if you have late classes and, RMIT in the city, for example, is the campus is, for those who don't know, it's like a series of buildings in the middle of the CBD, and it's not like a gated community, if you like. It's not, it's all sort of very spread out, and that can feel a bit daunting. And the outer campuses, where I am here today, is a little bit more like a traditional university campus that's like on a property and it's all university buildings, but nonetheless gets very quiet late at night and so on. And so that might feel a bit, for international students maybe who are wanting to stay in the library and work a bit longer sort of thing and might be leaving when it's dark and so on. Can you tell us, Piera, about what the security options are and what supports that students can get to feel a bit safer on campus?
Yeah, well, definitely that. First, I wanted to say that it is quite understandable that people can be, students can be worried about their own safety, and especially if they're coming from another country and they've seen some video footage in the media about people being harmed because of their race. I think that sometimes that can make people even more hypervigilant. But I do want to say that typically Melbourne is a reasonably safe environment, and RMIT actually does have a range of different, comprehensive, security services on campus so that students are feeling safe, especially, if they're studying at later times in the day. We have got, first of all, an app called Safe Zone, and that is great because by downloading that can alert security if a student is in an emergency situation. So it is being built in a way that people can get to that person who has alerted or pressed the sort of emergency button or an alert. There's also around-the-clock security patrols with RMIT. So there's like a 24-hour security operations centre. So you probably, students will see that there's a lot of cameras throughout RMIT, not only at the city campus but at the other campuses, so that, again, students are feeling as though they're safe. Now, we have got at RMIT what we call safer communities, and so RMIT is very committed to providing not only a safe but a respectful place for students to study and work. And so the safer community at RMIT is a dedicated service for, students and staff to report unwanted or threatening behaviour. So that's also another place that if students are feeling that they need, unsafe. That they can go to. And we also have online like a web page called Emergency and Crisis Support. So again, if a student at any point requires emergency assistance or is in a crisis situation, including mental health crisis support, well, RMIT has developed a list of contacts that will be useful that all students can refer to in a situation that they find themselves in a crisis or an emergency situation. So I think it's in terms of feeling as though that there is a level of safety, I feel that RMIT has been really quite responsive to that to ensure that students can feel really comfortable and secured.
Is it my understanding with security on campus that, let's say with after hours, and we know in the winter months it's going to get dark pretty quickly and pretty early on, is it my understanding that security can also walk people to their cars in the car park in the various campuses?
Yeah, so that's my understanding, that if students are feeling as though they need that type of support, that there will always be some sort of security personnel walking around the premises. And I'm sure if a student's asked to be accompanied, escorted to whatever, that they've been very, very helpful in doing so.
Yes. I think here at Bundoora, I know they actually have a car that is parked outside the security office. And so you can hop in the car with them and they'll drive you down to where your car is parked or outside of the campus. I think it's mostly inside of the campus, or there is an accommodation on campus at Bundoora, which is a bit of a walk away from the central building, so they could drive you down there as well. So pretty sure that they offer those sort of services just to help you feel safer. It's just good to know about those things. You might not otherwise be aware of them. But I'm glad you mentioned, Piera, that Melbourne is a relatively safe place. Like, I'm not saying that there haven't been crimes that have occurred here, but, certainly a fairly low crime rate in comparison to probably many other places in the world. So don't want our listeners to hear this who might be prospective or international students about to come to Australia and go, oh my God, they have to have security patrols on campus at RMIT because it's so unsafe. It's not the case, but it's just that we just really want to be preventative, I guess, and help people feel a little bit safer. So, but it is a pretty safe city.
And you want to be smart about it. So I was also thinking, even with safer community, you don't have to have a particular issue to go and see them or make a referral to see them, even if you want to know some of the preventative stuff, because they can talk you through that in an appointment too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Out of all of our conversation today, Piera, what would be your take-home message to our listeners on adjusting to uni and uni life?
Well, I think we've covered all this about new beginnings and change. And I think with change, it can be quite scary and daunting, but it also, on the other side of it, can be really exciting and development and growth. And I think that with growth, we have to sort of step out of our comfort zone, and sometimes that growth means being uncomfortable. But if we're not, becoming uncomfortable, then there's no growth, and that would mean that people can't sort of reach their full potential in achieving what might be wonderful things. So again, going to a new country and studying a new program and making new connections with people and experiencing a different type of culture and just a way of doing life. And so I think that the next time when a person is feeling a little bit uncomfortable, they might sort of remind themselves, well, I'm actually growing, I'm stretching, and it's only when we feel that stretch and we feel that uncomfortability that we know that we're growing, and that process to try to be nice to ourselves and know that this is the process, and that, and on the other end, there could be some just wonderful things that we can all embrace through the process of growth.
I think that's fantastic. I love that. Yeah, because I think, when you're feeling uncomfortable, you could potentially be saying, I'm not adjusting well. But actually what you're saying is that's actually a sign of the opposite in a way, that means you're growing. And I think that's a lovely way to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like uni life can be really enriching. It can be really challenging, but it can also be really enriching and rewarding and certainly memorable, particularly for people who are actually coming to Melbourne to study, choosing to do this for an extended amount of time. I think that takes a lot of courage, and I hope that it will be life-changing for them. And I hope our listeners today have certainly picked up a strategy or two, or picked up a tip or two, and in connecting with their own culture, if you're an international student, but also get out there, take some risks, some social risk, I guess, in terms of being able to connect with some of the local students. One of the things a lot of people talk about is how do we mix and mingle with that, and that is part of the experience at uni life. So I do thank you, Piera, for your time today and taking the time out to speak with us and impart your wisdom and resources about the different services and the different ways that students can adjust to uni.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Piera.
Yeah, thanks again. Thank you, listeners, and see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Counselling Armchair. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned a useful thing or two. Have a great week, and just remember that life can be amazing. See you next time.
Isn't life so amazing? Sometimes it can get crazy, but hey, that's okay. We've got another day to make mistakes and say sorry. There's no sense in our worry, 'cause all we can do is try our best to make it through with love.